The second reading is from Matthew 25, verses 35 to 40. It's on the Sanctuary Bible on page 35 of the New Testament section. Matthew 25. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, Truly I tell you, just as you did it for one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it for me. And Mark chapter 10, verse 45, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Excuse me, I have to shuffle papers. As Connie read, Leviticus 19, 33 and 34 states, when an alien lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. The alien living with you must be treated as one of your native born. According to Ellicott's commentary, a stranger is someone of non-Jewish origin, but who is joined or encouraged to join the Jewish faith. So the Jews were encouraged to treat them as friends, not aliens, on the grounds that the Jews themselves had been strangers in Egypt and were at first kindly treated. But what is the dictionary definition of a stranger? A person whom one does not know or with whom one is not familiar, a person who is not known in a particular place or community. Can I have a show of hands? How many of you know or knew your immigrant family members? 1, 2, not too many. My grandparents were Armenian from Turkey. My grandmother grew up in a small village in Turkey, Maraş, and worked there in a clinic run by an American doctor, Dr. Elliott. They were a family of 8 siblings and their mother. My grandmother never mentioned much about her father, or I just don't remember. The Turks didn't agree with Armenian Christianity, and for decades, starting about 1880 or so, they engaged in genocide. My grandmother and her siblings and mother left Turkey in a forced march in 1918. Of the 8 siblings, only 6 made it to Syria and onward to France and then North and South America. Her brother Samuel and his wife, and a sister whose name I don't recall, never made it to a ship to escape. They were killed by the Turks along the way. George Magar Mardikian, a Turkish-born Armenian restaurateur and chef, wrote, "You who have been born in America, I wish I could make you understand what it's like to not be an American, to not have been an American all your life. And then suddenly, with the words of a man in a flowing robe, a judge, to be one for that moment and forever after. One moment you belong with your fathers to a million dead yesterdays. The next you belong with America to a million unborn tomorrows." I've done some research on immigration. American historian Oscar Handlin, who's a professor of history at Harvard, once said, "Once I thought to write a history of the immigrants in America. Then I discovered that the immigrants were American history." Immigration has taken place in waves. Now my history teacher hat. From 1820 to 1880, a time called frontier expansion, most immigrants were from Northern or Western Europe, and on the West Coast, Asian immigrants to help build the railroads. From 1880 to about 1915, the industrialization period, most immigrants came from Southern or Eastern Europe. Many in this area here came to work in the mines. From 1915 through 1970, there was a slowdown in immigration due to the two world wars, but those that came were mostly from Western Europe. Post-1970, immigrants were primarily from Asia and Latin America. How many of our own ancestors entered this country since 1820? The president of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, Krish Omara Vinarajan, which I'm sure I didn't say that right, stated, "We welcome refugees not because they are American, but because we are American." George H.W. Bush stated, "Nearly all Americans have ancestors who braved the oceans, liberty-loving risk-takers in search of an ideal, the largest voluntary migration in recorded history. Immigration is not just a link to America's past, it's also a bridge to America's future." Why do people immigrate from their homes? To join family, for opportunity, because of poverty in their home country, because of danger. That was the reason my grandmother and her family left. I want to paint a word picture. Please close your eyes for a minute. Warsan Shire, a British poet of Somali background, stated, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." Think about that for a minute. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. My grandmother lived in the mouth of a shark. Woodrow Wilson stated, "We came to America, either ourselves or in the persons of our ancestors, to better the ideals of men, to make them see finer things than they had seen before, to get rid of things that divide, and to make sure of the things that unite." Those who emigrated, who are now called immigrants, face struggles. Language is a big one, and language often determines how they were viewed by others. There was a Little House on the Prairie episode that some of you may remember. Mrs. Harriet Olson was a pretty snobby owner of the general store. She was just better than everybody else, or so she thought. There was a new family that settled in Walnut Grove who had emigrated from Germany to Minnesota. Their English was not that great. Mrs. Olson looked down her nose at them because they couldn't even read the Bible. Can't you just see her saying that? Charles Ingalls was in charge of the Sunday service one week and asked Mrs. Olson to come up and read the Bible for the congregation. She was all for that. But the Bible he gave her to read from belonged to the immigrant family. Mrs. Olson looked at it and said, "Well, I can't read this." "Why not? Wasn't she literate?" Her reply was that of course she was literate, but she can't read that language. Charles then invited the male member of the German family up to read the passage, which he was able to do in German. Charles pointed out that speaking a different language does not make someone illiterate, and that applied to both the German family and Mrs. Olson. My grandmother read and spoke 3 languages, Armenian, Turkish, and eventually English. She was certainly not illiterate. Other struggles that immigrants face is housing, employment, schooling, and making friends. A quote from President George Washington, "The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respected stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome." This is not a new idea, limited to 2024. George Washington, 1796. So why do we welcome the stranger? President Lyndon Johnson said, "The land flourished because it was fed from so many sources, because it was nourished by so many cultures and traditions and peoples." Barnes's notes on the Bible state that the union between Christ and his people is the most tender and endearing of all connections. It is a union not physical, but moral, a union of feelings, interests, plans, destiny, or in other words, he and his people have similar feelings, love the same objects, share the same trials, and inherit the same blessedness. Hence, he considers favors shown to his people as shown to himself. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothing and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And the king will answer, I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. Gill's exposition on the entire Bible reflects on this. For I was hungered, and you gave me meat. This and the following are not mentioned as causes of the kingdom being prepared for them, or of their being entitled to it, but as descriptive of their characters and evidence of the grace of God in them. They are not our entitlement, but evidence of our character and evidence of God's grace. This brings me to the current situation in Springfield, Ohio. Legal immigrants from Haiti, valued workers in many of the businesses in Springfield, being harassed because they're different, speak a different language, have different customs, but still giving to now their community. Maybe it's because I knew my immigrant family members that this situation hits closer to home. For my family, it wasn't Haiti, it was Turkey. For my great-grandmother, who never spoke English, but who welcomed a little 5 or 6-year-old child to visit her in New York and got her message of love and care across to me. For my Uncle Manasseh, who in his 80s opened his home to Bob and I and our then 2-year-old Kathy, and loved on her even though he was then blind and couldn't see her. We all have stories, either those we lived ourselves or were passed down from others. A Jesuit priest, Father James Martin, had a posting this week on Facebook. What Jesus never said. Feed the hungry only if they have papers. Never said. Clothe the naked only if they're from your country. Never said. Welcome the stranger only if there's zero risk. Never said. Help the poor only if it's convenient. Never said. Love your neighbor only if they look like you. Strangers? Or just friends we haven't met yet?